Louisa.
What's good? What's good? Give me a one if you can hear me. We about to have some fun tonight and get it in about African science. Just gonna wait for a few more people to roll on in. What's good, Trigger Happy? We're gonna get into the basics of African science. It's gonna be a really, really basic conversation. Not getting too deep. At least I'm gonna try not to get too deep. But I just want to go over the fundamentals. And let me know if y'all have ever heard, if you've ever heard about the notion of African science. If that's ever been something that you came across, and what do you really think about it? You about to get it popping, popping. Let me know if the music is at a cool level. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely needed, because there's a lot of different, assumptions, false assumptions about it. Yeah, I mean, ethnomathematics, a common theme that you see is the application of ethno to everything. Basically, when you're dealing with non-Western science and technology, history, ethno is an easy label to attach without actually fully engaging with the information. Peace, Taga Haru. We finna get it in about African science, and just let me know if you could hear me cool. As you all are coming in, just let me know if you could hear me. We're about to get it in. I mean, for me, this is my favorite conversation because, really, when you're dealing with African civilization, the notion of African civilization, a lot of times, people stop when we're getting into some of the hard sciences and just the different fields that we have. Was good in Mateb University. It's great to have y'all here. And it's good that you can hear me loud and clear. Yeah, we're just going to go ahead and get started. So this is going to be a presentation about African science, just the fundamentals of African science. I'm going to try not to make it too complicated, but we're going to delve into just the background and the history and the legacy of African scientific principles. Yeah, that's facts. This is important because, when you're getting into the type of reality that we're constructing for ourselves, it's really important that we have the proper principles as we're engaging within development. So this gets into the origins of scientific thinking. Those of y'all who've heard some of my presentations before, you hear me mention about how Pan-Africanism is really, you can't separate it from paleoanthropology, because when you're dealing with African people, you're dealing with the origins of humans. So when you get into the origins of scientific thinking, human thinking emerged around 1.8 million years ago with the Acheulean culture. Then you have systematic inquiry into the natural environment in the human experience. So, about 1.8 million years ago, you had some of our ancestors, some of these archaic human populations beginning to develop means of inquiry and an examination of the natural environment. So the development of human brain coincided with the emergence of pyrotechnology, or the emergence of different fire-based technological systems. So this is a very important theme, and it gets into what I was discussing before. When you're dealing with Africology or Africana studies, you're rooted within an analysis of paleoanthropology. So according to Van Horn's analysis, he views Africology as the study of the centrality of Africa in the emanation of Homo sapiens sapiens as sentient beings capable of constructing concepts of right and wrong. These terms are not used here as solely ethical moral ones, and these concepts guide life-preserving contra life-destroying behaviors that have been and are transmitted transgenerationally, transmillennially, and universally. So according to his analysis of Homo sapiens sapiens, our ancient African ancestors, he finds these four interlocking social forces: the behavioral force, leadership force, educational force, and the resource force. And these behaviors were central to the development and evolution of human beings on the African continent. So within these different cultures and civilizations, you have the development of African philosophies. And one of the greatest examples of this is the pharaonic mindset, or the mindset of the Nasut. And it's anti-materialist in that it sees each entity's hidden essence as its primary reality, and that which is exposed by light as the illusion. So our ancestors, as an example, if you were to glance at a red light, and you close your eyes immediately, you would see green. To our ancient ancestors' mindset, that green and black was the reality versus the white and red would be the illusion. So they saw things from an anti-materialist perspective. Then you also have the monistic and vitalist quantities, vitalist being related to the vital force in everything, and monistic being related to the single, or the one, the monad, the whole. And it sees everything as part of one whole and source. Then you have an element of harmonious monism, and this is unity between all that can be seen, felt, and thought of. So there wasn't necessarily a separation between physical reality, visual reality, and mental reality, but more so a harmonious relationship between all of the three. So from the application of African philosophy, you get African logic. And African logic is diunital and complementary. And when we say diunital, that means it's based upon both and propositions as opposed to either or propositions. And its validity is based upon custom or proverbial. It's proverbial validity as opposed to validity based upon form. And the soundness in African logic is based upon whether or not the conclusion is relevant to the premises. So if I say that all black people are African, that's true because blackness is African in origin. But even though in the Western sense, there would be some black people who don't identify as African, if we go to Paleo-African linguistics and we look at the customs of African language systems, we can find words like Nitkunul. You could find words like Adulawo in Yoruba. You could find words like Mbunesen in Medumba, Ndombe in Kikongo, Kimi in Metremin Kimi, that relate and refer to our blackness. So in an African logic sense, I could create a proposition that's valid and sound. All Africans are black and all blacks are Africans. But in the Western logic sense, that wouldn't necessarily be completely valid and sound. So the relationship between African logic and African philosophy basically govern the way that African scientific principles are applied in the real world, and we're going to get into that. So you also have context-dependent variables and wedge implications. So that kind of goes into what I was discussing before, in the fact that, African logic is more so contextual and causal, as opposed to bivalent or based upon either or, true and false propositions, as you see in the West. And give me a one if y'all are still hanging on. Give me a two if you want me to simplify things a little bit. And if not, we're going to keep on going in. So, these different variables are kind of what we were discussing before in terms of the relationship of African logic. African logic isn't necessarily based upon either or propositions. It's based upon both and propositions. So it's not necessarily a true versus false conversation. It's more of a true, false, and the excluded middle. African logical systems are always looking for nuance between different propositions. And that's the complementarity aspect of African logic systems. So right here we have, some three terms by a doctor, an Igbo doctor by the name of Chinakonum, and he basically examined the different logical systems of the Igbo people, the Yoruba people, the different people on the African continent, and compared them to systematize African logics. And he came up with these three variables. You have Nwansa, and that's a peripheral variable, or an agent that proposes and protests the criticisms of its proposal. Nwanju, which is a peripheral variable or an agent that opposes or contests the proposals of Nwansa. And then you have Nwa-Izugbe, and that's a central variable that represents the complement or conversations of Nwansa and Nwanju. Nwa-Izugbe is a product of creative struggle between the peripheries. So this is Chinakonum's formulation of the different logics that are used within the African continent, in the sense that you have a central variable, which would be Nwanju, a peripheral variable, which would be Nwansa, or an affirmation and a negation, and Nwa-Izugbe would be the complement, or the subcontrary set of those two propositions. So from the application of African logic to understand knowledge about reality, that's when we get African science. And African science reveals knowledge about reality using the inferences developed from the trivalent African logic. So basically propositions related to those different three parameters that we discussed earlier: the affirmation, the negation, and the complement, or Nwansa, Nwanju, and Nwa-Izugbe. So African science analyzes physical and visual effects with metaphysical and metavisual inferences that are used to validate or falsify propositions with respect to the trivalent nature of African logic. So based upon the complementary realities governed within African logic, the African scientists can use this information to discern elements and aspects of reality. So again, the central questions of African science would be different from Western science, because the application of logic in Western science is based upon an either or proposition, whereas in African science, it's more both and. So all scientific traditions started from magic, which is the basis of what we call empiricism. Empiricists were originally called empirical philosophers. So when you're looking at the development of empiricism or experimentation, most of these traditions around the world started from magic traditions. So when we look at what we got, such as voodoo or Ifa or Odinani, right? La Akam, right? These different systems, Candomblé, Umbanda, we can use these different systems as the foundational metaphysical inferences to build experimental traditions. Empiricists were originally called empirical philosophers, and Sir Isaac Newton was an intermediary between the early magic traditions of Middle Age Europe and modern empiricism. And Emi Dolu, which is an African logician and philosopher, his paradigm views theological traditions as a blueprint to build science upon using African logic, right? So based upon Emedolu, in an analysis of the traditions of Africa and the traditions of the world, he says that we can use these theological traditions, these spiritual traditions, as a blueprint for the construction of African scientific paradigms. Peace, Buana. All respect and all love. I'm trying to go in and basically dispel a lot of notions, of many people that I see say, oh, there's no such thing as African science. And they try to say that, oh, science is all universal. There's no such thing as African science. The science that we learn in the West can be equally applied all over the world. But that's just not true. If Western philosophy is a particular way and African philosophy is a particular way, and then the West is Aristotelian bivalent logic and Africa has trivalent logical systems, it stands to reason that the African scientific traditions would have been developed from a different context than these Western traditions. And right here we have the criteria of African science. So these are just different terminologies, lexical items that were discovered by China Konam that basically say that in some of our pre-colonial societies, you had the concept of various scientific processes that we can analyze today. So you have usoro, and most of these words will be in the Igbo language. Usoro means process, scientific process. Then you have njiko ala mumu na ala mamadu, and that would be the confluence of the natural and the subnatural worlds. Natural being that which we could physically, tangibly quantify, and the subnatural would be our mental experiences. Then you have Memuputa Isioku, and that would be the articulation of a research problem. Memuputa Achoba, and that would be the formulation of the hypothesis. Next you have Ichouzo, which would be an experiment. Omenala, which is the theory. Ichauzo, which is setting aside. Iwu, that would be a scientific law. Inabata na iju achoba, that's asserting and denying of the hypothesis. Next, we have some African scientific theories, and this is again compiled by Dr. China Konam out of Calabar University in Nigeria. You have Uwa Ezuoki, and that means the universe is not boundless and limitless. There are certain aspects of the universe that can be discovered. Whether or not they can be discovered by the human mind or by other means, such as artificial intelligence, we're going to get into that. Then you have Ojibenji, and that is no autocratic way of doing science. So basically, we're going to get into that a little bit later, but we're getting into the whole idea formulated by the Austrian philosopher of science, Feyerabend, about epistemological anarchy within the scientific process. Then you have Amasi, and that's the universe is incomprehensible by the human mind. And next we have Ifiomimi, which means there is certain knowledge about the origins of existence that is impossible for humans to understand. So Ifiomimi basically coincides with Amasi and Ojibenji. So if you understand that there's no autocratic way of doing science, and the fact that humans can't necessarily, understand the fullness of the universe and of existence, you can kind of see how these theories coincide. So next we're going to have some scientific laws. We have Egueji, which is the law of means, right? So Egueji basically means that there is always a meaning and a purpose of something. There's never a scientific process without a purpose. And when you understand like environmental ethics and the fact that, it's very unreasonable and unethical to say that we should just be able to use all of the resources on the planet without a regard for nature or the environment, Egueji as a scientific law would basically prohibit that and say that there's a meaning and a purpose and a holistic connection to things. What's good, Gina? Next, we have Iwu Ibi, which is just the law of magnetism. Iwu Ndichi, which is the law of discordance, right? And then you have Iwu Nyibi Onwe, which is the law of uniformity. So these basically mean that there's aspects of the universe that would be in discord, such as entropy, and then there's aspects of the universe that would come into uniformity based upon the unified field theory. And we're going to discuss that a little bit later on. Reggie in the bushes. Was good, Reggie? We having some fun. So next you have the cycles of African science. So these are just different African scientific periods or cycles. And it's important that, when you understand African science and African history, we don't necessarily see it linearly. It's more so seen cyclically and concentrically. So these cycles repeat themselves based upon certain parameters. But according to the analysis of Dika Akwa, you have the Ngindi, which would be, some of the ancient prehistorical periods, 300 to 7,000 years ago, 300,000 to 7,000 years ago. You have Koba, which is 7,000 BCE, and that could be connected to the Green Saharan, Kifian and Tenarian related industries in Gobero and Niger. Then you have Kwankwan, and Kwankwan would be a period related to the emergence of classical Africa in Kimi and Kush, 4,000 BCE to 350 of the Common Era. Then you have Kwan, which is 350 to 1591. That's the emergence of most of these West and Central African states. And then Kesi, which is 1591 to 1801. And that would be the Ma'afa, what we know as the Ma'afa. And you have Ipanya, 1801 to present. And that would basically be what we know as the illegal slave trade, colonialism, the Berlin Conference, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a variety of African scientific achievements, and we're not going to get into all of them, but, just to go brief, we have these siderolithic industries, these Iron Age industries all over the continent. I have a video on my channel called The African Iron Age, where I go into the Agjujtian tradition in Mauritania, the Egazarian tradition in Niger, and the Urewes and the Gambian tradition from the Great Lakes region, all the way over to Western Africa. And each one has different themes, like agri-horticulturalist within the Urewes and the Gambian region. And then you have herding and certain pastoral traditions in the Egazarian and the Agjujtian traditions. So it's a pretty good video, African Iron Age. And you have obviously the Dogon astronomical observatories that saw Sirius A and B, the Akauku writing systems of Thumban in Cameroon, of the Bamoun people and the people of the grass fields, the Merkut at Giza, that's the pyramids. And then you have the Caesarean section seen among the Kahuru or the Kahura people in Uganda in the 19th century. So within these different cycles of African science, we have evidences of Africans developing certain technologies to match their reality. So in the modern time, you have a variety of African inventors. You have Arthur Zhang, he's the inventor of the cardiopad. Burton Nahum, he invented the robotic neurosurgeon. And you have Kwadwo Safo, the founder of Kantanka Automobile Company in Ghana. And then Victor Abenyenyu, which is the inventor of the polyvalent wireless communication system. So that's just basically a way for people to communicate without using fiber optics, long distances. So again, within the African space, you have the development of science and technology, not necessarily on Western means, but on means that match the African social system. So these are just a variety of scientific institutions, some cultural institutions on the African continent based upon African science. For those who say that African science isn't real, obviously you can see that in a variety of countries, you have different academies dedicated to African science. You have the Cameroon Academy of Sciences, the Academy of Science, Research and Technology in Egypt, Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, Kenya National Academy of Sciences, Académie Nationale Malgache of Madagascar, Nigerian Academy of Science, Academy of Science and Technology in Senegal, South Africa, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and the list goes on and on. You also have the African Mathematical Union, and that's more of an African scientific institution on a continental scale. So now we're going to get into the history of Western science. For those who say that Western science is universal, it's obvious that it has a trajectory. There's not just one universal science. Each culture has a history of how they developed scientific traditions. So the first one is you have Aristotelian observationism, which is from the 4th century BC to the 12th century of the Common Era. And that's basically the first period of European science. And this mode of scientific thinking quantifies reality itself as a byproduct of our perceptions and sensations. This scientific process is inductive in nature in that particular observations lead to the construction of general laws. This is very limiting because it is based upon the notion of circumstantial uniformity in nature, or the false idea that natural events always occur in the same way. That's absolutely not true. After Aristotelian observationism, you have Grotesquian empiricism from the 12th century AD to 1920. This is the next period of Western science. And this mode of scientific thinking is rooted in the magical traditions of Europe and the transition from magic tricks to controlled lab experiments. This is also inductive in nature because the experiments are based upon particular observations and the inductive formation of general laws in a controlled setting. After that, you have logical positivism. And this mode of scientific thinking promotes the notion that all theories come from observable and testable facts. It is rooted in the analytical synthetic dichotomy in language, as well as the verifiable theory of meaning. This movement led to major discussions about the demarcation between science and non-science. Popper promoted the tool of falsification as a way to distinguish between the two. But falsification fails when we consider the role of probability and the interdependence in various scientific fields. So logical positivism would be popular if you've seen people talk about how there's no such thing as African science, and they kind of promote a universalist approach when dealing with science, as if it's all the same. They would be logical positivists. They would be metaphysical naturalists. They would be people who say that if you can't test it in a controlled experiment, then it's unverifiable, it's not true, and it can't necessarily be falsified. But when you analyze some of the statistical parameters and how different fields can be interrelated, in social sciences, you call that intersectionality, but you could be like, there's civil engineering, then mechanical engineering. Mechanical and civil engineering are both engineering, but both fields aren't exactly the same. So you have a level of interdependence where pure falsifiability, or if something is purely falsifiable, that wouldn't necessarily match the reality that we experience in the sciences. So that led to, just understanding the falsehood and the problems with logical positivism. That led to the development of Kuhnian science. And this mode of scientific thinking is based upon the incommensurability of different theoretical paradigms, or the idea that scientific principles in different theoretical frameworks will be judged differently. An example of that in physics is you got Aristotelian physics, Ptolemaic physics, which is more classical, and then you have quantum physics, and they're all judged by different metrics. So, in a classical physics paradigm, you may have certain rules for celestial bodies, but these are not going to necessarily be the same rules for subatomic particles and quarks. So based upon the incommensurability of scientific paradigms, you understand that as you develop, the rules for science are going to change. So from that, you have post-Kuhnian science, and this mode of scientific thinking promotes epistemological anarchy and the decentralization as the best method of scientific progress. Feyerabend, who's an Austrian, is the primary promoter of this form of science. And that basically says that there's no one way of doing science. All you have to have in order to do science is an applied system of logic, or an applied way of understanding the validity and soundness of different propositions with respect to the ascertaining of knowledge. So the idea that there's one universal way of doing science is absolutely not true. And the history of Western science certainly shows that, So that now we're going to get into some of the myths. And these are by a Nigerian scholar by the name of Ogunniyi. And these are some of the myths that the scientific paradigm currently in the West promotes. We went over before how, there's a specific tradition when it comes to Western science. It's not all the same. So now we're going to get into the myths of the Western scientific paradigm. So success is the result of rationalism and empiricism, and objectivity exists in science. There is only one way of coping with experience, and a mechanistic view of the world provides an accurate explanation of the way the world works. There's certain things like, psychological conditions, certain, emotional conditions that we can't necessarily prove materially. There's different avenues and different ways to understand the human experience and to ascertain what exactly it is. So let's get into some of the differences between Western science and African science. So Western science studies inanimate objects, and African science studies vitality and sentience itself. Western science examines effects to discover causes, whereas African science seeks to find the factors of cause that influence effects. Basically looking at the why and the how. So now we're going to get into some methods of African science. And if y'all are feeling this presentation, please hit my Cash App. I greatly appreciate it. What's good, Jolanda Black African Power? You already know. So the first method of African science, and again, this is going to come from Chinakonam, and these are going to be, his formulation of the different methods that he saw within African logical systems and scientific systems, and he's going to use some of the Igbo terms to conceptualize them. So the first is Akunwale, and that's trial and error. And this is when you play and make errors until the correct result is found. And this is mainly used in circumstances of limited information. Then you have Ako Iju Ase, and that's what you could call inner science. And this establishes a link between the human mind and thought. Thought deploys a vital force and illuminates the human mind by creating elliptical motion among the objects of analysis. So within Ako Iju Ase, the natural world contains positive matter and negative antimatter. So positive matter would be that which we could physically quantify, and negative matter would be that which we could see. So then the subnatural realm is the realm of thought, and this is neutral. So theories and hypotheses are found simultaneously, and this explores the metaphysical aspects of experimentation. What's good, proof evidence? We having fun. So the next method would be Ako Imiobi, and that's intro science. And this is research problem this includes a research problem that contains what is needed and its utility. So you discover what you need and why it's useful. That's going back to the means. Okay. Give me a one if y'all can hear. Give me a one if y'all can hear. Gina says she having auto issues. It's all good. If it's perfect sound, we could continue. All good. I see a one from Trigger, one from Proof. All right, let's get into it. All right, so you have Ako Imiobi, which is intro science. And this is a research problem that includes what is needed and its utility. The mind develops hypotheses and determines how it may or may not fail. So in Ako Imiobi, the research problem is chiseled to the last detail without hypothetical propositions and categorical distinctions. The mind in this method is a machine to develop hypotheses. In Ako Imiobi, you have precision and perspicuity, and you have the treating of each isioku or research problem as unique to develop its own achoba hypothesis. So you have research questions found before each hypothesis. The next you have is Akonyiri Onyi, and that is SEM science. It is based upon the senses and inductive inferences. So this generalizes scientific results across similar circumstances. Senses measure certitude linearly with one-to-one correlations. And the last method in this set you have is Akosonazu, and that's causal science. And this traces the causal link between phenomena in terms of agency inferences and universal occurrences. So the mechanist in this sense would study effects, while transcendentalists would study cause. And that's getting into the different fields of African scientific analysis. There is a mechanist tradition and a transcendentalist tradition. And this is going to be in classical Africa. And right here you have the Amashu mathematical papyrus from 1650 BCE. And you have different parameters that our ancestors used. Yeah, the pale fox got some serious issues. So first you have is Tep, and this is Tepeseb, which is the correct method. And this would be related to some of these later logical systems that we discussed before. This is the evolutionary root of these. So you have Tep, the identification of the problem. Then you have Chetnek, which would be the articulation of the problem. Then you have Better, which would be systematic inquiry. Then Sheshmet, which would be the examination of the evidence. Then Eret Mcheper, which would be the notice of the emergence and the discerning of the solutions. And the next would be Retpu, which would also be, or Irit Mcheper is the notice of the emergence, and Retpu would be the discerning of the solution. And then you have Gimmick Nefer, which would be the establishing of perfection and the setting aside. Tepesep. Yeah, I gotta practice my Merem and Kimi. Nofritasoni. So again, when we're talking about African science is real. African science is true. And we have different paradigms of modern research on the African continent relating to these scientific traditions and these scientific principles. We went over the institutions that we have based upon African science, and now we can easily discuss the application of modern research today on the continent. So first we have Owusu Ansah and Nji's disability research and their disability paradigm. And basically they talk about Africological thought systems and the way that they could be applied to manage those of brothers and sisters who are disabled. Then you have Tanya Anwiwa and Chikwanya's forest management system. So they're looking into the application of Africology into the agri-horticulturalist systems and dealing with the way to manage the African environment holistically. Then you have Samenang's psychological development. As we understand, our ancestors, they dealt with different parameters of psychological analysis, dealing with, kind of what we discussed before in terms of harmonious monism, that which we can see, feel, and think of. So with relation to the different psychological problems that we have, we can develop different means of, determining certain ailments, determining certain issues that we may have, being able to psychologically analyze and test people according to these different paradigms that we can observe within classical and contemporary Africa. Next, you have Mpofu's intelligence paradigm, dealing with intelligence and intelligence testing. What is intelligence? IQ obviously cannot measure the full spectrum of human intelligence. Then you have Nkabela's cultural anthropology, Ngada's pedagogy with dealing with education, Njangtungia's ethnobotany, and Itabari's information science. For those who are familiar with the Journal of Pan-African Studies, Itabari, he has a lot of different evidences with relation to library science and about how our ancestors were the first ones to create and manage libraries. That's Reggie's field. I appreciate it. I appreciate the compliment. I mean, we got to go in for the ancestors. So then you have Oyibo's Gagut, which again, this would be an application of African science in the development of a unified field theory that unites all of the fundamental forces of the universe. So what this equation to the right basically says is that the partial derivative of existence, or God's mind, if you will, with respect to space-time is zero. Basically meaning that everything in the universe, generally speaking, is contained. And we kind of went over that a little bit earlier when we're dealing with the theory in African science that the universe is not necessarily boundless or limitless, but at the same time, the human mind is not able to comprehend the fullness of the existence, or of the realm of existence. And I know God is definitely, controversial, in the sense that, what our African ancestors were talking about when they were dealing with God was more so the realm of existence itself. It wasn't necessarily some pie in the sky type of deity in the way that it's articulated within the Western construct, right? So Oyibo's equation in the application of African science in God Almighty's grand unified theorem basically says that the partial derivative of everything, seen and unseen with respect to space-time is zero. And again, this is based upon the analysis of African thought systems. So then you have Jean-Paul Mbelek. And Jean-Paul Mbelek is one of the students of Cheikh Anta Diop and Théophile Obenga, Notre Père. And basically, he deals with the origins of the universe. He examines different creation stories on the African continent, and he applies it to the understanding of mathematics and physics to basically understand the creation of the universe and the different processes of the Big Bang versus the Big Crunch. And right here, he has a hypersphere analysis, and you can see those roaring waters of noon in the middle. That's that gray circle right there. Then you have space and time, or the spatio-temporal dimensions. So up here, he says that the hypersphere marks the final of the expansion of the universe and the beginning of its shrinking. And that's this outer circle right here. And then right there in the center, those roaring waters of noon, the roaring waters of noon mark the end of the shrinking, or the crunch of the universe, and the beginning of its expansion. And this is a spatio-temporal representation of the schematic phases of the evolution of the universe. The constants Tp and Lp are designating respectively Planck time and Planck length. And they are explicitly defined by the following variables below, and that's C, H, and G. And these are some different variables. So you have Planck time and Planck length. You have Planck temperature right here. You have the speed of light right here, Planck constant right there, the gravitational constant, the fundamental electric charge, and the permittivity of the vacuum of space. So, that concludes my presentation. And I just wanted to get into the basics of African science and show people that African science is definitely real. We definitely have examples, institutions. We have university professors. We have, scholars like Jean-Paul Mbelek. And, Jean-Paul Mbelek basically continued on, Diop's analysis and telling us not just to get into history, but go into the hard sciences, physics, marine biology, engineering, architectural analysis. And he was able to, again, use African logical systems about the creation of the universe, such as the roaring waters of noon, to have an accurate conceptualization of the existence and destiny of the universe mathematically. So I'm gonna, open up the floor for anybody who wants to come on in. And I appreciate everybody. What's good, DOD? Yeah, I mean, it definitely eliminates certain positions and assumptions, because again, when we say Obatala, when we say Chukwu, when we say Ra, when we use these different terms like Wak, we're not necessarily talking about a being like Yahweh in the Western Abrahamic sense, but it's more so dealing with existence itself. So I'm gonna post a link right quick. Let's see if and again, if y'all got any questions about the presentation, we could go in. Feel free to come on in if y'all want to. Don't be shy. I appreciate it, Gina. I appreciate the support. It took me a while to compile some of this stuff, but it's just some of the things that I had in my little repertoire. I appreciate the proof evidence. Man, I thought I would have, a lot more pushback with this, a lot more debates and disagreements. But I mean, it's cool if y'all feel, if y'all feel that it was good, and y'all ain't got nothing to add, then we could close it on out. You say Oyibo should stick to physics. I mean, Oyibo is a physics, and I think he did some aeronautical engineering. So, yeah. Does that link work? I'm trying to pin this. All right, the link is pinned. The link is pinned to the top for anybody who wants to come on in. Y'all got any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. All right, well, this has been a chill conversation. This is. Oh, you want me to get into Daggett? That's gonna take some time. That's gonna take me. I would have to do that on another show. But if you want to go deeper into it, basically what Oyibo was essentially trying to do was to understand every equation imaginable in the universe, whether it's nuclear equations, electromagnetism, gravity, with respect to this fundamental equation. The idea that space, time, or everything conceivable that we can conceivably quantify, the partial derivative of that with respect to space-time, right? Or the partial derivative, I know Reggie's going to, because he used the term God, or to basically conceive that, or if we could call it the realm of existence itself, the partial derivative of that with respect to space-time, or its rate of change, its partial rate of change with respect to space-time is zero, meaning that it is the infinite. It is, the unification of all, basically. And there's certain geometrical solutions to this, and that would take me a much more that's a much more advanced type of conversation. But he was able to basically conceptualize that using this equation and using an analysis of creation, African creation stories, and African thought systems to conceive this. So it's a pretty unique equation, and he's gotten a lot of credit for it. But obviously, we're going to have to develop the different systems that we have based upon this on our own. Like, we can't necessarily expect the Western world to give African people credit. That's our job. But with that, this has been a pretty chill conversation. We went over African science, just some of the 101s. Feel free to, go back and watch the playback. And, if you have any questions about this presentation, leave it in the comment section. And with that,
Louisa.